Hi, I'm Dawn Cavanaugh, APQS Education Director. It's hard to believe that I took my first quilting class almost 30 years ago in 1991 from a lovely gal named Rita. Rita taught my mother-in-law and I how to quilt. We learned all sorts of things, from how to piece and applique blocks all the way to hand quilting. But one thing the class never got around to at the end was how to finish the edges. When I got to the final steps of this particular quilt that I learned about, I needed to figure out how to do the edge, and I didn't know how to do binding. Well, the only thing I could think of was to turn the backing inside and around the batting and bring the quilt top around, and then I finished the edge with a simple slip stitch. Well, only later did I learn that it actually has a name. It's called a knife edge finish. Well, now that I know how to do binding, most all of my quilts get regular traditional quilt binding. But there's still a place for this knife edge binding. First, you can see that even on this quilt that's almost 30 years old, it looks quite nice without having that extra piece of fabric around the edge. So maybe you're doing a wall hanging or a rug mug, or mug rug, that's what it's called, or something like that that you're wanting to have a finished edge on, but not necessarily that extra lip of fabric. Maybe some placemats, for example. Or maybe it's a modern or contemporary quilt where you really like the clean look of not having that binding. Facing is one option, but a knife edge is also a possibility. So I've put together a project to show you how it's done, and I'm even going to add some prairie points just for fun. Let me show you my project. I am absolutely in love with all sorts of ombre fabrics. I adore how much they change color and shading from one to the other, running in many cases the entire rainbow. Well, I thought it would be fun to take some ombre fabrics and set them against a black background for that high contrast. And to have a little fun, I'm going to take that ombre fabric and make some prairie points that are going to go on around the outside here on my little miniature block. And I'm going to use Susan K. Cleveland's Prairie Pointer to help me get those done. Now my block actually finishes out to be about 9 inches finished, so my prairie points, I'm going to make them to be about 1 inch tall, and that way I can evenly space them around the outer edge. Susan's Prairie Pointer tool actually comes with a book to tell me how big to cut my strips, and the piece of steel template also allows me to press right around that to get good crisp edges. So I've followed her instructions to make all the strips. I want a 1 inch tall prairie point for around my project, so that means I needed to cut my strips 2.5 inches so that when it gets folded down and is accounting for the actual seam allowance, it'll be just right. So what I'll do is take this to the ironing board. I'll be going one at a time, folding each one of these prairie points so that the mark I need on the prairie point reference tool is correct. And then I'll be using that to press that nice and firmly. I'll get to work and show you what they look like when I'm finished. So I followed Susan's instructions to make a 1 inch tall prairie point. I actually had to cut a 2.5 inch tall strip, actually very similar to binding. I can get it apart here, and fold it right sides together and then starch it so that it's nice and crisp. And then I'm going to place that down on my board here, and using Susan's tool and the marking here for a prairie point of the size I need, I'll line up the tool with the two raw corner edges of my folded fabric. And I'm going to fold that over and fold this one over. See if I can get my fingers out of the way for you. There we go. And place that iron on top, and then slide the tool out and give it a good shot of steam. And take a look at that nice, crisp prairie point. Awesome. My prairie points are ready to go. You have a couple of options when you're adding edge embellishments. One is to actually add them to the quilt top before you do the quilting, and then they'll be rotated and flip out after we do the knife edge. But it is possible to attach them after you've done the quilting on your project as well, as long as you stop your quilting within a 1/2 inch of the outer edge of your quilt. That's necessary to give you enough room on the quilt and the backing fabric to turn those both on the inside. Now, of course, I'm not going to use red and white cording on my quilt, but if you are using something like a cording or some other more elaborate embellishments, the same is true for those. It may be easier for you to add those now as the quilt top is being completed, as opposed to trying to insert them when the quilting is all finished. Well, I'm going to play with my colors, and I'm going to baste then my Prairie Points to the outside of my little quilt top. I think the hardest part is deciding where they go. The first pass I had the yellows on the top. I think I like it a little better with them scattered around the edges. When I'm placing the corner Prairie Points, I'm going to make sure that the Prairie Points edge comes right out to the corner of my quilt top. And the next one is going to lay right next door to it. They are not going to overlap, as I've got the rest of these, which are staggered and overlapping each other just a little, well, actually by about half. And then that way, when it gets flipped to the outside, there won't be extra bulk or anything in that corner. So I'm being probably a little overcautious here, but I'm pinning each one of these in place the way I want them. Now, I have so few here that I'm comfortable here eyeballing their placement to a certain extent. If you were working on a larger quilt, you may want to go ahead and place the center Prairie Point in line with the center of your quilt, or evenly spaced 2 Prairie Points to the left and right of that, and then stretch them out in between each of those 2 Prairie Points in the middle, or that single Prairie Point. That way you can make sure that when you come out to either end, you don't end up having to realign the entire line of Prairie Points to be able to stitch them in place. Now, it's possible to go ahead and actually just stitch these in place using a 1/4 inch seam right here along the edge, because all of these will then flip open and that 1/4 inch seam will hide inside the quilt. I might baste first. Once I get them all pinned down here, I'll see how I feel about that. Sometimes I like to baste simply because then I know that I can adjust the points themselves and I don't have to worry. Let's put this last little guy in here. Make sure he lines up in the corner. And he does. I'll put those 2 back. And pin this one. And I'm going to swing this around and just readjust this little guy right here. He's not quite coming out at the point. Make sure they're looking good. Okay, to the sewing machine we go. I'm going to start with a little scrap, folded over scrap. It's often called a spider because as you continue to use these, lots and lots of little thread tails end up being left behind. But this little extra piece of fabric makes it easier to transition from the scrap fabric onto my main piece without having my threads get all mucked up and jumbly at the beginning. Okay, I'm using a 1/4 inch foot. We'll align that and away we go. I'm going to use a seam ripper to help me, or a stiletto as possible, to also keep those Prairie Points in line. When I reach the actual corner, I'm going to stop with my needle down right where those 2 Prairie Points meet. And one more stitch here. And I'm just going to pivot the entire piece around. So here you can start to see how that first row of Prairie Points has gotten stitched down. Now if if I'd overlapped my points the other way, it may have been easier to sew if I'd have done this, because I'd been falling off of this onto the next prairie point. I'm going to remember that for next time. But for right now, maybe it's because I'm left-handed, the way I stacked them, every prairie point is having to feed under the feed dog. So I'm going to have to take a little more time and be a little more cautious with each one to try and improve my accuracy. A couple more pins to take out. Here we go. Okay, so now we can take a look at all of those prairie points sewn along the edge. So now is the time for us to do any quilting. We'll layer this together with my black backing and my batting, and then we're going to end up turning this to the inside, and then the backing will be turned to the inside, and then we will whip stitch those two together. So it's time to do a little layering and quilting. Although I've quilted plenty of small quilts on my APQS long arm, this little guy is so small that I'm actually going to just do him on my domestic machine. I think I'm going to use invisible smoke colored thread to simply stitch in the ditch around this beautiful ombre fabric. Once that's done, then I'll be able to turn those raw edges in and show you how to whip stitch it closed to make that wonderful knife edge. We'll make sure still that we have enough backing and batting past the edge of the quilt. And again, if you're doing something like an edge finish like this, you'll want to stop your quilting, again, about a ½ inch away from the raw edge of the quilt, so you have enough room to turn all those embellishments over. Well, all the stitching in the ditch is done around my blocks, centers, and then I went around this border one more time. Here's a quick tip if you haven't really used invisible thread on your machine before. This tip also works for long arm machines. The most frustrating thing people have with invisible thread is that it tends to break a lot. But that's also because we don't know how to comfortably adjust our tension. So I've got regular thread in the bobbin for this project and the invisible thread on the top. If you have your tension set for the way it normally is with your sewing, that thread is going to stretch and eventually break. Let me go back and set the tension to where it would be normally for regular sewing. Push my buttons here on my machine. Let's see if I can also zoom in just a little bit so that we can get a closer look at that invisible thread. Okay, so I have the tension now set for normal sewing, and I'm going to drop my pressure foot, which will engage the tensioner on this machine. So when I pull now towards the back of the machine with that invisible thread, there's a lot of pressure. It's actually pulling the needle quite significantly. And when I let go, I'm hoping that the camera can pick up how kinky and curly that thread is. It's going to want to just jumble its way up right there. That's where the tension is actually a sign that it's way too tight. What's happening is the invisible thread is stretching as it's passing through the tension discs and all of the thread guides. So we need to loosen that tension so that it behaves a little more like regular thread. For me, I have to take it down several steps from my normal tension all the way down here. Let's see what that is like. So I'm going to pull out some more. The needle isn't bending as much, but now when I let go of this thread, you can see, hopefully get it in the light here, it does have just the slightest wave in it, which means that it does have some tension on it. That's good, because we can have it too loose and we could end up with bubbles or loose thread on the back. This more gentle, softer wave is acceptable for me to at least start and then check my tension. Lift up the foot and let's take a look at the back real quick. Well, except for some threads that obviously are needing to be picked up with a lint brush, the tension's looking really quite nice with that invisible thread in the top. And the invisible thread in the top. There, I'll get the right thing showing for you. and that regular black thread on the back. Now that the quilting's done, it's time to trim the backing and the batting to the appropriate lengths. To make it easier to see than the black fabric and black batting that I'm using, I've got this little sample with some extra Prairie Points left over to show you what I mean. So we need to trim the black batting down so that it is actually inside of the stitching line that's holding our Prairie Points in place. And I'm going to flip that out of the way and the backing fabric out of the way so that I can trim that down. For me, the easiest way to do that is to start by first trimming the batting even with the Prairie Points. Then I can flip the top of the quilt out of the way and take another 3/8 of an inch off. I'm going to swing it around this way, being a lefty. That's easier for me to do. Get it in place here. Making sure all of the, put the white on here so it's easier to see. The white is out of the way. We'll trim the batting, or get the right B word, the batting, even with the Prairie Points. And now I'm going to flip the top out of the way, making sure the backing is still clear as well, and take another 3/8 of an inch off of the batting. There we go. You can see it's sticking past just a little bit here for visual purposes. The batting is a little bit shorter than the seam line that was used to attach those Prairie Points. That's because the Prairie Points are going to be flipped out and around the actual batting piece, trapping it inside, making it nice and full. That means that our last step is to trim the backing fabric to within 1/4 of an inch of our finished quilt top. In other words, the gray stitching line. So really, that's going to be trimmed right even again with those Prairie Points. And then that I'll take to the ironing board and press under so that I can whip stitch those two closed. Swing it around again for the lefty in me. And trim this off, even with the edge of the quilt. Okay, so I'll take it over to the ironing board and turn that under 1/4 of an inch and press, which will make it easier for me to actually do the hand stitching. Now that I've got the backing pressed under a scant 1/4 of an inch, when I lay the batting back over the top of it, you can see there's that little extra 1/8 of an inch that I had trimmed away from the batting. It's got just a little bit of the backing peeking past it. And that's going to work out just right so that we can bring those Prairie Points around and open them up. And then they're going to align up just on the back side here. And this is where we will hand stitch it closed. In addition to pressing the backing fabric here in my little sample over that scant 1/4 of an inch, I also pressed the Prairie Points up. Now, if you didn't have these Prairie Points and you were just doing the standard knife edge, you'd do the same thing with the raw edge of the quilt. You would take that raw edge of your quilt and fold that over that 1/4 of an inch, press it, and then that edge is going to wrap around the batting. When we're sewing the backing down, we want to keep the stitches as invisible as possible. So you'll use a stitch similar to what you'd use to sew real binding down on the back side, kind of a ladder stitch or a blind stitch. If you're not familiar with how that works, what we want to avoid is stitches that cross over at an angle. If, for example, you bring your thread up over here on the green fabric and then you cross over into the yellow and then cross over again, you end up with a zigzag all the way down. Instead, we want to bring our thread up on one side of the seam and then enter right next door to it on the opposite side. On the back side, we will travel at an angle up to the next spot. And we will then take another stitch coming up in the green, going down in the yellow, and then travel on the back side to pick it up again. So what you'll see are straight stitches that resemble a ladder all the way along the edge of the quilt. I'm going to insert my thread a little distance away from the fold and come out right in the fold, in this case of that white, which is representative of our backing fabric. And then you can tug a little bit like you would to bury a hand quilter's knot to pop that knot into the layers of the fabric. I'll catch just a tail of that Prairie Point, angling it slightly so that I can come up again in the white fabric, just barely catching the fold, and then pulling tight. So straight across again into the Prairie Point just above, angling across to the white fabric, and then a tug. So it's straight over that little ladder stitch, angling slightly to come across into the fold, and then tightening it up. If you were actually looking at a competitive situation with this, you got to make sure those stitches are invisible, nearly invisible, can't hardly see them, and close together. These are about 1/8 of an inch apart. If you get them farther apart, then there's a chance that actually they could come undone if someone would catch something on that. I'll get just a couple more stitches in here and then hold it a little closer so that you can hopefully see what's going on. A little tug helps bury that thread down into the fold of the fabric. I'm only trying to catch just a couple of stitches of that white folded fabric right there, right along the edge. That's how you'll do it. Blind stitch or ladder stitch all the way along the back side of your Prairie Points to finish off the project. And if you're not using Prairie Points, you'll simply be turning the two raw edges, your backing and your quilt top. Let me hide the Prairie Point in here to help you imagine what that would be like. And you'd be stitching those two edges together. Well, I'm going to finish my project and show you what it looks like when it's all done. Ooh, but before I do that, I thought of one more little tip. That is, how do I deal with the corners when I meet them? Well, of course, one way to do that would be to fold one end in and then fold the other in and actually just overlap them. That does leave you with a little extra bulk at one side. But you can also treat those corners just like you would when you're going to do your binding. If you fold that in, I'm going to finger press it here so that you can see it a little bit. I folded it in so that it actually forms a miter. Then when I fold this corner in and this side in, see if I can hold it and get my fingers out of the way, you're going to get a really nice mitered back side, and that's going to be easier to sew down when you're turning the corner, especially with the Prairie Points. So this is the backing fabric, an example of how to flip that little corner inside and make it a little easier than one that happens to be just folded over to a blunt edge. Well, I finished the handwork. It's all done. Don't you just love how that ombre fabric just makes the quilt sparkle and the sun seems to shine all the way across it? I could just eat it up. One of the cool things about this knife edge technique, especially when you're adding things like Prairie Points, is that it almost makes the quilt reversible, since there's no extra fabric around the backside to draw your attention away from what's going on. Give this knife edge technique a try. You'll find that it's very easy to do. Well, be sure to check us out on Instagram, like us on Facebook, and follow us on our APQS YouTube quilting channel. We're glad you're here. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.